Okay, hello, hope everyone's doing okay. Like Alex said, my name's Tom. I'm an investigative reporter with the Globe and Mail. I'll just talk really briefly about what that means before we get into the meat of the matter, this thing that we call Canada. You want to unmute myself? No, later. So, you know, my job at the Globe, this basically means that I spend a very long time looking at very specific issues. In the past, that's been everything from, you know, I spent 6 weeks last year unraveling why there were so many delays at Pearson and all of the systemic causes for that. Before that, I spent a few months looking at the, you know, the hospital crisis that already exists and is only getting worse over time. And before that, I've looked at, you know, everything from securities fraud to the risk assessments used in federal prison to, you know, other forms of white-collar crime, gun crime, you name it. So I've been all over the map, but one thing that's been consistent the entire time throughout that work has been my use of freedom of information. So, you know, it's funny to talk about civic tech because I feel like freedom of information is a kind of technology in itself. It's a pen and paper, you know, legislative technology, but it's one nonetheless, and it's a very important one that's very important for democracy and our democratic principles, and it's one that most people don't really experience or use or interface with almost at all, unless something happens in their lives and then they really, really need it, and then they start to use it. So briefly, what is freedom of information? You may can I just get a show of hands who here is familiar with the freedom of information concept? Okay. Okay, yeah, that's about right. I didn't expect everyone, and I didn't expect no one either. So FOI, that's the short term usually, is a legislative mechanism that exists in many countries, if not most countries at this point, that allows you to basically write a letter saying, I would like this information from a public body or from the government. You send it off, and then they are required by law to respond and to produce records, produce data, produce video, photo, whatever you're asking for within reason, subject to certain fees, of course, and whatever. And so you can imagine that these systems are pretty important, right? Because we use them as journalists all the time, academics use them constantly, but really the biggest user groups are actually the general public, so regular citizens and, you know, people living in the city or interfacing with the provincial government in any way, and businesses. And those people are usually asking for a whole whack of things. If they're a private citizen or just someone, a member of the public, they may be asking for their HR file. If they work in the public service, they may be asking for the trash pickup schedule because they want to find out why, you know, their trash is being picked up less frequently. They may have gotten into a car accident and need a copy of their police report for insurance purposes. The classic case that where FOI comes up for people. So there's also, of course, the concerned citizens, people who just want to understand, you know, why am I paying more in this obscure municipal tax? You know, why is this sitting at the federal government involving my immigration file taking so long? So it's people like that that are filing, and businesses who are asking, you know, why did we lose this RFP? You know, how much did you pay out in these contracts for the last 5 years for, you know, research purposes or whatever? And then, of course, like I said earlier, there are people like me and there's academics, but we're a much smaller group, maybe 10 to 20% of the overall. Almost everyone else is public and businesses. So that's FOI in a nutshell. Canada has FOI laws for every province, territory, and the federal government. So we have 14 different laws. Technically more than that because some provinces have 2, one for municipalities and one for the province as a whole. So these laws are extremely important. They're really important for, you know, holding government accountable, understanding how public bodies are operating, and they are unfortunately quite broken in Canada, a lot more than in the States or in a lot of other countries, because they've been, you know, languishing in obscurity. They haven't been updated by the government because the governments often don't like these laws. They are annoying. You know, you have to imagine if you were, well, some of you are public servants maybe, so you may be familiar with this, but you're working away your job, you get an email from someone saying you have to produce these documents in the next 4 days. You have to stop everything you're doing. It's a huge pain in the ass. It's really annoying. So the government doesn't like it, but the way that I've always explain to people that it's kind of like going to the dentist. You know, you don't like it, but it's good for your health. And FOI, the government may not like it, but it's also good for its health too. So Secret Canada is an effort by the Globe and Mail, by me and my colleague Robin Doolittle, also an investigative reporter, to try to understand why the system hasn't been working. Robin and I have both used FOI a lot over the years, so we're very familiar with its failings. And so we started from a position that's a bit unusual for an investigative reporter. Usually, when you start a project, you don't know anything about the subject, and you become an expert over the course of 4 to 6 weeks. With FOI, we already knew a lot, so it was a bit of a different experience, but we didn't understand why requests take so long. Why is it that when I file an FOI, it takes 6 to 9 months for the federal government to respond? Why is it that in Ontario, I can be asked to pay $5,000 for documents that I get asked to pay nothing for in Newfoundland or BC or the federal government? Why is it that, you know, when I do get the files back, often they're heavily redacted, and I have to go through a years-long appeal process to get those redactions removed, and often you do get them removed as you take them to appeal. Why does that all happen? What's the reason for the system? What's going on? And so that's the genesis of this website here and on the computer, Secret Canada. Secret Canada is a two-part operation or machine. On the one side, we have all of the investigative journalism, the reporting, that's, you know, stories in the newspaper, for lack of a better word. And then there's also this civil service, public service website that I'll talk about in a minute. But I just want to run you very quickly through the reporting. I'm not going to spend much time on it because I think the website is the thing that's much more interesting to you folks tonight. But we published, we started in early June. Now it's early July. And I think we've published about a story every 2 or 3 days since then. So we've been doing a lot on this. Some of them are quite big. Some of them are smaller. So here is the first story that kind of unraveled it all, that goes through excruciating detail. What's wrong with FOI? Why did we get here? What's going on in all the different provinces? We also conducted an extensive audit of every provincial and territorial federal government to look at how they responded to FOI requests. We filed more than 500 FOIs last year to get an understanding of that. It's all in this story, which is not painful, so I invite you all to read it. I think it's pretty interesting. We have, you know, stories that talk about building a national database of requests, which I'll get into in a minute, that goes into, again, excruciating detail on all of the steps we took, data cleaning, what we did about how do we account for people's privacy concerns, all that kind of stuff. We have stories about doctors who are trying to find out why they were fired from a hospital. This was a story that some of you may remember during the pandemic. This Dr. Brooks Fallis was abruptly let go from a hospital system. He was a very active Twitter doctor. Why was he let go? He's trying to find out through FOI, and his fight has become pretty confusing and frustrating for him in a lot of cases, because he keeps getting stuff redacted and then having to fight an appeal to get these sentences unredacted that reveal more and more about how the province likely exerted pressure on the hospital that's getting fired. We also look at the performance of every department in the country, ministry department in the country, which we published online. We have like an enormous table that you can go consult if you really care. This is kind of this was a service for the public servants themselves to see how they compare, because it does become a bit horse racy after a while when you look at how these different operations across multiple levels of government are faring. We also have looked at the immigration system, which is overwhelmed with access requests, or I guess the access system, which is overwhelmed with immigration requests. Well, the headline says it the other way around, also true. 80% of all federal access requests are regarding immigration files. So that system is completely broken at this point, and it's in large part due to systemic decisions that RCT made, the Immigration Refugees in Canada, Refugees and Citizenship Canada made more than a decade ago, technology-wise. So that's a very interesting story. We've also looked a little bit at some places that are doing FOI well. So this is a story about Newfoundland, which is kind of like a promised land for FOI right now, because they had an enormous scandal more than a decade ago that led to some serious reform. And it's a complicated story. I won't get into it right now, but it's all written up here. Their performance is incredible compared to most other parts of the country. All FOIs are completed, almost all FOIs are completed within 20 business days. No fees are charged in general. Very rarely do they ever assess fees. Appeals are completed within 13 weeks. No questions, they never exceed that timeline. So there's a lot of interesting reporting and we have more stuff coming. But I want to talk about this website, supercanada.com. From the beginning, we knew that we could write a lot of stories about FOI, but I was kind of like shouting into the void a little bit, more so than usual. So we knew we wanted to do something that was also a public service in some way. In the same way that FOI is a public service, we wanted to give something back and extract information from the government that we could eventually, that could be useful to people trying to do this stuff or looking to understand more about civic processes at the municipal, provincial, or federal level. So Civic Canada is the result of more than 450 FOIs over the course of 20 months. The idea here was that we wanted to create a central repository for all of this knowledge that's being generated by the government and sent out to individuals. The problem is that, we don't know what someone down the street got in an FOI packet or a province over, because this stuff is not published for the most part anywhere. So a lot of effort is going into collecting these documents, collecting this information and sending them out to the public, but it's not being made useful to other people. And so what ends up happening right now is that a lot of people don't know that an FOI is filed and will file for the exact same thing. That's happened to me many times. They may, spend months banging their head trying to figure out the answer to a question that's just sitting in a document in someone else's house already, that has all the information they need. It also is just like a very interesting directory of information that the government public bodies hold. So we wanted to get all of that metadata and make it available online. And so that's what we've done with Civic Canada. We filed FOI requests to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of public bodies, and we've collected all of the metadata. So the date of the request was filed, the request number or ID, the summary text of the request, so like what was the request about, and the disposition. So how much was released? Was everything released? Was nothing released? Was it partially released? What was the deal there? And we collected all of this information right across the country. The sum total now is that we have over 300,000 FOI summaries in this database, which is by far the biggest central repository of FOI in Canada. And it's pretty powerful. I mean, we can look up University of Toronto, and you'll see there's 107 requests that refer to U of T in some way. The first result is about some kind of contract with U of T run by the Privy Council Office, which is the Prime Minister's department in the federal government. So wonder what that's about. I mean, you can probably find out by doing a little bit of research here, but that's immediately interesting. Here's a Toronto Police Service thing looking at violence on university and college campuses in Toronto. That sounds very interesting as well. We also knew as we were building this website to service that we wanted to allow people to very easily get these documents, because they're not always easy to collect, right? You have to know how to file an FOI, you have to know the language to use, you have to know where to send that information. So we try to keep the barrier as low as possible. But what that meant was that we have this button that will generate a letter that you can just copy immediately, and then you send it off to the address that we provide. So, you can copy that, you can put it in an envelope and mail it to the police. Here you go. And then you'll get that document back in hopefully a month, because theoretically there's no redaction work that has to be done. The document's ready to go. So this is a tool that I, as a journalist, have wanted for a long time, but even as just like a normal member of the public rubbernecking, it's very interesting. Like I've spent hours going through the city of Toronto results and seeing what's being released. Toronto Police had some very interesting stuff that, not only could those be stories, but they may also affect your neighborhood or your community. They may be, you can look up your street and see what people are asking for there. So there's a lot of potential with this data. We know that a lot of people have already filed. We think thousands and thousands of people have filed requests based on this database. We also provide a bunch of other services. We have a list of all the institutions that we're tracking. It's 600 in all. So you can see I'm scrolling a lot. There's a lot here. There's hospitals, there's securities regulators, we have police forces, we have all of these, like, public bodies that are not exactly departments, but are related. You have CBC, we have, like, here's an energy utility, all that kind of stuff. So we have a transit commission, we have all of those. So it's a really powerful database. But there's also all of this other, stuff that we knew we had to include. So we wrote these extensive guides on how to file FOIs, how to navigate the process once you filed, because it's a bit of a negotiation. It's not exactly you ask for it and it comes back. They will call you and say, did you mean this? Oh, we don't have that, but we do have this other thing, or that'll be $1,000, please, whatever they might say. So we teach you how to navigate all of that. We also teach you how to appeal a decision if you need to do that. Because that process can also be a little bit inscrutable. They really shouldn't be. The government should be better. The governments should be better about this. But lacking with that information lacking, we figured we'd fill that void. So there's probably like 30,000 words of guides here. We've also provided a bunch of other stuff. We have a page that shows examples of the FOIs that journalists will mail filed and the stories that they led to. We have a FOI tracking sheet template, which is based on a template that I've been using for years that helps you keep track of requests if you file a ton, as I do. Likely not the case for most of you, but you never know. And then one of my favorites is this letter generator that is like kind of plug and play. You put in the information you need and copy it and send it to the institution of your choice. And we have a bunch of templates here. So say you want to request a government database, something that would be perhaps interesting to people in the civic tech community. This is the form letter you need to use. Well, you can use other letters, of course, but this has been bulletproofed over time from my own experience requesting databases from the government, as well as my conversations with colleagues in the US who dealt with similar issues. Part of this was written by lawyers in the US, who I took their language and adapted it. Thank you, lawyers. So there's a lot of stuff here that's really, really powerful. Look, if you want to ask for a police report involving you, there's no mystery. You just do what this guide says, and you will get that information at some point. There's also, a bunch of other stuff, like we have an extremely detailed methodology. We have a news website, basically. It's a blog, really, that talks about, that's very specific to FOI and like the really nerdy FOI stuff. But yeah, there's a lot here. It's an incredible resource, and we're very excited for people to use it. I mean, the institution list alone, I think, is pretty impressive. Like, for instance, pull up Toronto. There. So you can see there's 17,000 requests in the database. We have notes for every single institution of what the data range looks like, how we obtained the data. In this case, it was downloaded because we have an data portal. Good for you, Toronto. Not bad. As well as information on how to request, how to file an FOI to them, and how to file an FOI if you don't know how to file an FOI to them, which is also, so there's a lot of information on this website. We're pretty excited about it. We're going to keep working on it. It'll be updated next. We're starting the next round of FOIs in a couple weeks, and that'll probably take 2 to 6 months because some of them take forever to respond. But yeah, I think that's about 15 minutes. So maybe we can jump into question discussion there.
So the way that we'll do this is we'll make sure to go back and forth from online and in-person questions. So if you're online and you want to ask a question, drop a Q in the chat, and we'll do our best to alternate back and forth. So let's start out online. John, I see you have a question. Oh, sorry.
Hi. Oh.
We'll go through you next, but John is going to start. Sorry. Go ahead, John.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask whether or not you had some thought of about the work of getting rid of or substantially modifying Crown copyright, because one of the reasons I think we do fairly badly even with information that is actually intended to be public is that in the United States, the Americans have the attitude that anything produced by the US government, unless it is actually classified, is born into the public domain and has to stay there. Canadian agencies, in my experience, have had an attitude more along the lines of the data they produce has a relationship with them very similar to, say, the relationship with a record label with Elton John's latest song. They're entitled to monetize it. And I've actually had to pay fairly substantial fees to get the census of Canada, which is not a freedom of information thing, but it is essential for making cogent comments on public policy as a citizen. And I know there's a lot of stick handling that goes along in terms of people getting information through through a friend at the university, but that's still a problematic way around. And I wondered if some of our problems might have something to do with that. That's it.
Right. So just to summarize what John was asking there, I think he's asking about the Crown copyright system we have in Canada. In the US, documents released under FOI, and honestly, documents produced by the government in most cases are either in the public domain or will become part of the public domain eventually, given a certain amount of time. But in Canada, governments retain what is called Crown copyright. That basically means they retain rights over those documents. And it's even true of documents released under FOI, which is very odd because obviously you're giving these documents to the public. So that I've always found that argument to be a little bit, iffy from a metaphysical standpoint, if you will, a epistemological one. You already gave me the files, what you're going to ask for them back, it doesn't really make sense. But it has come up in the past. It's funny, it was actually the second time in a week that I've been asked this question, because I'd never heard of Crown copyright investors. So the answer is, I don't know what effect Crown copyright has. I suspect that the reason why we are so much more secretive in Canada than in the US, which is much better on a lot of this stuff, even though it's the US, they're very transparent. I mean, I think you can learn all you need to know about the difference in our approaches to this when you consider that at the federal system, the federal law in Canada is called the Access to Information Act. Access to information. The federal law in the US is called the Freedom of Information Act. So there's a difference there, right? One is about letting you have something, and the other one's this is your right. This is the freedom. So I suspect that the issue is a lot more around the Westminster style system of government than it is about the Crown copyright issue. I think Crown copyright comes out of that. Honestly, we wonder if at some point a government's not going to come after us and say, how dare you publish this information online? It's our information. But I'm excited for that fight because I think it would be worth having. So I don't know. I think it's a lot more about the Westminster style form of government than it is about Crown copyright. But John, to answer your question, I can't. I can't know for sure. Who's to say?
Thanks, John. So we had a question at the very back.
Experience in audit, governance, risk, compliance, and cybersecurity. I specialize in privacy. That's just a background. But my question really was, I came in late, so I was wondering if you can recap for a minute or two what the initiative is and the purpose of.
Sure. Yeah.
Specialists, and if you do have slides that you can share with us after.
No slides this time. Just links. I'll send the links out around that. So yeah, in the 1 minute version is that. At the Globe and Mail, we filed a lot of FOI requests, and we've noticed an erosion of the FOI system over time. So we decided to do something about it instead of just griping at the bar like journalists usually do. And so the end result is both an investigative series that is ongoing, and those are some of the links that I'll share with you folks afterwards, as well as this website, which is also one of the links I'll share with you afterwards, which is a database of more than 300,000 FOI request summaries collected through more than 450 FOIs filed in the last 12 months. Yeah.
We have a question online from Al.
Hi. So first of all, I want to commend you for the excellent work that you've done. I think it's a really great service to institutions. I mean, individuals who want to engage with in democracy, and I played around a little with the website, and I found it very user friendly. and very straightforward. So, you know, that's something that's really great. A quick question I have is, I imagine that you know, suppose I was to put in requests for, you know, a large number of documents. I can imagine, you know, I've seen testimony sometimes where, you know, people in a better position than me ask for documents, and they send you a pile of papers that
Sorry,
are.
Al, we just lost the audio.
Okay.
Hey,
Did you
sorry,
hear
just give us
that?
1 sec. We're gonna try to.
I heard a noise, yeah.
It was like a short or something.
Is it inside there? It kicked me out here, but I think that we will be back in a second. Yeah. Whatever happened. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Al, sorry about that. You want to try again?
Yes, no problem. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll try to make it quick. Commend you for the excellent work. Going forward, like let's say that you know, I make requests on certain documents, and they're heavily redacted. For example, I think you brought up that example. What would an individual like me, who's not you know, an investigative reporter, who doesn't have experience in this, and you know, before hiring any legal counsel or anything like that, what would they do if they just get a bunch of documents or a significant number of documents that are heavily redacted? Is that somewhere, like, does the Secret Canada website you know, address what I may want to do, or what people may want to do if that's the case?
Does it ever? So the system, the FOI system in Canada, the FOI systems in Canada, because we have many of them, all are built on the idea that you should not have to be a lawyer to get documents from the government. I mean, that's ridiculous. And the answer is that in most cases, you really don't have to be, but you do have to be a bit insistent in some cases. So we have a page here on guides that talks about the appeals process, is what you're talking about. Every FOI request can be appealed to often what's called an information privacy commission. Sometimes it's an ombudsman, but usually it's an information commissioner. And they can often say, you must unredact this, you must release that. Some of them don't have those powers, it's complicated, but for the most part they do. And you know, barring that, you can always go to court. But really, like, almost no one needs to go to court because usually the appeals process does work, even though it takes a very long time in some cases. So we have a guide here that walks through, again, in excruciating detail, how to appeal. In your case, it sounds like we're talking about redactions. We have a whole section on appealing redactions that you can go through that will tell you, you know, what you need to do, what kind of things you have to consider, how much of a legal argument should you be expected to be making. The answer is usually not much, but you can if you want to. I do that because I often know the arguments that the police or whatever are going to make, and I know what I need to do to counter them. But yeah, like, it's all here. You'll be able to, it should walk you through the process. Again, not assuming that you're a journalist or a lawyer or whatever, just it's written for normal people trying to request stuff. So I would take a look at our guides because they're very detailed. Robin and I poured our heart and soul into these over several months. So hopefully they'll be useful.
Yeah, thanks again. And I just want to echo what I said before. It looks extremely user-friendly. So thanks for that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
I find this whole topic really interesting. There's some feedback going on. Okay, all right. As a former civil servant, I've been on the other side, and the process is very interesting because sometimes within governments, it's hard, like for one department to get information from another department, let alone it's a whole myriad of bureaucracy. And I've always really been fascinated by what is deemed open data, public domain information, and the tension in why is this now an FOI? And it's also really interesting and troubling, like, what retention are there for public domain documents that then are then kept private? And I think that's something to really, like, understand further. And there's also a lot of different tensions between what the government will consider litigation privilege, solicitor client privilege. I've had to catalog stuff for open data and say, okay, we can't release this, so we can release that, send it off to the open data people. And also a lot of times, like, I've worked supporting lawyers, and what happens is sometimes the department will come in and say, I need a legal opinion should this be released or not? But that's like, I wouldn't know any of this if I hadn't worked for the public sector as much as I had, and I'm not. But just thinking about this, I just think it would be really interesting as a project. I'm not sure if it falls under your project, but just like, what is the decision making on what is considered FOI or public domain and open data? Because I think some of it is frankly arbitrary, and some of it could also depend on the government at the time, what they would consider, and you know, and also the evolution of the thinking.
Yeah. So the thing about open data, the dirty secret about it, as I tell people, is that most of the stuff that gets published to open data portals is not very valuable. And it's like, you know, if you go to the federal open data portal, it'll be the mushroom grower survey, these like shape files of the country, you know, data sets that are extremely transactional and limited, that don't really have a lot of, you know, accountability value, journalistic value, research value, members of the public value, right? So, and that's not to say that all of it is like that, certainly not the case. There's a lot of open data that's great, but the way that the government decides, and I say the government, I mean all governments decide what's going to become open data, it inevitably goes through like a prism of risk analysis. And so they're not going to publish anything that could be even remotely risky to that. Like why, the attitude is, you know, often, I've talked to many people about this over the last couple of years. Why would we publish something that could embarrass us or create problems for our bosses or whatever, when we can just not publish it and let people request it if they really want it, right? So a lot of my fights are extracting the stuff that the government may have decided, oh, you know what, we're not going to do that. A perfect case in point is federally, I had a story about this in November. The feds have this portal, the Open Canada ATI portal. Oh, I think I see it. Here we go. The feds have this portal, the Completed Access Information Request portal, which is similar in some ways to what we're doing in Canada, but a lot smaller. And if you see a document that you want, you can't just download it, you have to go and request it. And this request system exists outside of the FOI process, so it's not legislatively guaranteed. I've waited a year for these in the past. So it's kind of crazy. And you know, they could never respond, and that would be totally fine. And they have, in some cases, for me, there's no way to appeal it or whatever. This system is crazy, because what this does is when you fill out this form, it sends an email to the department, and then they put that in the queue to process. So it's completely bonkers. The answer could be that these documents are just available online. And other governments do this. BC does it, Newfoundland does it, Yukon does it, most of the Quebec ministries do it, and some municipalities do too. So it's not impossible. The reason why they haven't done it is because lawyers at the federal level advised the Treasury Board years ago that they would have to translate every document into French or English, the case may be, because of language laws. And that would mean that they would require, it would cost between, it was like $2 and $4 billion a year to do, which is ridiculous. And the funny part of all of that is that I've spoken with people who said that's a crazy assessment. You wouldn't have to do any of that. I spoke with a former languages commissioner. Federal language commissioner said that's ridiculous. That's baloney. We don't have to do any of that. So that is going through that prism of risk, right? And the risk here is not what happens if you publish the documents. It's what happens if someone gets angry that a document is only available in a certain language and launches a lawsuit, and we're exposed to, you know, all this kind of litigation risk that we were exposed to previously. So that is the problem with open data international life, which is why FOI is still so important and powerful.
Another thing also, some of the open data, which is not very section, but also the file format that is, it can be really versus, it's like only an Excel document or something machine reading, so you have to make sense of it once you get it. And I also wanted to just follow up one last thing.
Yeah.
Is that like, have you relied on anything auditor general telling you?
You know, it's interesting. I don't think the OAB at the federal level, the Office of the Auditor General, has looked at this recently, but it's a system that's been on fire for years. So it would be very interesting to see if that were to happen. So to your point, and just before we move on, about files and the quality there, here is a file from the annual statistical report of all the federal government on ATIP, sorry, verifying.
share.
Oh, yes, I can do that. Just gonna do the desktop. Okay. And this file drives me absolutely insane. The format that they've taken is extremely wide, like this. You can see we're up to like the LK columns. It's bonkers. And the 4 columns change every year, so they're not cross-comparable, which is insane. And this is the kind of stuff that someone who is used to working with data would say, absolutely do not do this. There's like a better way to structure this data in tidy format, if you will, or whatever. But this is not that. So yes, a lot of problems in the open data, public domain, FOIs here.